Most of us were taught that prohibition was a moral crusade, preachers thundering from pulpits and carry nations splintering saloon doors with a hatchet, a nation of churchgoers rising up to outlaw the bottle in 1920. Then 13 years of speakeasies, bathtub, gin, and Al Capone, until everyone admitted the noble experiment had failed. It is a clean story. Half of it is even true, but it cannot answer the one question that matters most. The temperance movement had been preaching, marching, and smashing saloons for a full century. Why did it keep losing for 100 years and then suddenly win? The answer was never in the pulpit, because the pulpit had not changed. The same sermons that lost in 1881 and 1919. What changed was in the treasury's ledger. In 1912, roughly $1 federal dollar in every 3 came from alcohol, and it had been that way for half a century. 7 years later, the United States outlawed the product that was helping to pay its bills. Liquor taxes were the second largest source of federal revenue in America, behind only the tariff. The government of the United States was, in cold accounting terms, a business partner of the saloon, and no government bans its own paycheck. So this is the story of how that paycheck got replaced. The income tax did not, by itself, make America dry, and this video will not pretend it did. What it did was remove the strongest practical reason Washington had for saying no, and once that reason was gone, a century of moral pressure finally had somewhere to go. Morality supplied the army. Accounting opened the gate. Before it is over, this story will pass through a lobbyist who ran Congress for a decade without ever holding office. It will pass through a federal chemistry order that made bootleg liquor deadlier, and through 2 of the richest men in America funding repeal, while critics said they were buying themselves a tax cut. The most famous criminal of the century will be brought down by the very tax that started it all. And it ends with a brand new president, in his 3rd week in office, asking the country for a beer. So let's go back. Not to 1920, and not even to 1913, but to 1791, and the first fight America ever had about a whiskey tax. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, trying to pay the debts of the Revolution, put a federal excise on distilled spirits, and the frontier exploded. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, who turned their grain into whiskey, because whiskey traveled better than corn, tarred and feathered the tax collectors. In 1794, President Washington called up an army of nearly 13,000 militiamen and rode with it as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania, before handing command to Virginia's governor, Henry Lee, to put the rebellion down. The lesson Washington's government learned was double-edged. Americans hated the whiskey tax. And the whiskey tax worked. It could be collected, and it brought in real money. Jefferson repealed it in 1802, and for 60 years the federal government lived almost entirely on customs duties. Then came the Civil War, and with it the same desperation for revenue that has driven every fiscal revolution in this story's family. The Revenue Act of 1862 taxed almost everything that moved, and when the war ended and the emergency taxes were stripped away, 2 survivors were left standing at the center of the system: tobacco and liquor. The 2 habits Americans would not give up became the 2 pillars Washington built on. The excise system that grew out of the war was a marvel of quiet efficiency, and it is worth pausing on how it actually worked, because its design is the reason it became untouchable. The tax was not collected from drinkers. It was collected at the distillery gate and the brewery door, from a small number of large producers who could be inspected, gauged, and bonded. Revenue officers measured the barrels, stamped the bottles, and the producer rolled the tax into the price. The drinker never saw a tax bill. He just paid a little more for his glass, night after night, in every saloon in America. A tax that is invisible, painless to collect, and attached to a habit is the closest thing a treasury ever finds to a perpetual motion machine. Here is what the machine looked like for the next half-century. From 1870 to 1912, customs duties and liquor taxes together supplied more than 2/3 of all federal revenue. Liquor alone supplied roughly 1/3, by some estimates closer to 40% in peak years. Translate that into the things the money bought. The Army, the Navy, the federal courts, the pensions of Union veterans, a large share of everything Washington did was carried by men standing at bar rails, paying a hidden tax with every glass. The scale of the entanglement produced one of the great scandals of the age. In 1875, the whiskey ring broke open in St. Louis and several other cities, a conspiracy of distillers and federal revenue agents who had been skimming millions in liquor taxes, and the trail ran all the way to President Grant's private secretary. The corruption was possible because the liquor tax was enormous, and the liquor tax was enormous because the Republic ran on it. When a revenue stream is big enough to corrupt the White House staff, it is big enough to protect the industry that generates it. And this is the wall the temperance movement kept hitting decade after decade. The movement itself was real, vast, and sincere, The Women's Christian Temperance Union under Frances Willard built one of the largest women's organizations on earth. Millions of Americans genuinely believed the saloon was destroying families, and by the 1880s and 90s they had the numbers to frighten any politician. And to be fair to the marchers, the thing they were marching against was not imaginary. The turn-of-the-century saloon was often the political and social center of its block, a place where wages vanished on payday and machine politicians bought votes with free lunches and favors. In thousands of them, the brewer owned the building, and the barman owed his license to the ward boss. The movement's anger had real fuel. What it did not have was an answer to the treasury question. Every time a prohibition bill appeared, the same argument killed it. If you close the saloons, who pays for the government? The industry knew the number too, and it said so in public. The brewers and distillers understood their fiscal shield perfectly, and it made them arrogant. Their trade associations reminded Congress, year after year, that the industry was the Treasury's partner, that beer and whiskey paid the nation's bills. As long as that was true, they believed they were untouchable. For 50 years, they were right. There was one way out, and everyone on both sides could see it. Find the federal government a different paycheck. Which is why the story of Prohibition now runs through a courtroom, because in 1895, in a case called Pollock, the Supreme Court struck down the young federal income tax as unconstitutional. The one obvious replacement for liquor money was legally dead, and it would take a constitutional amendment to revive it. And here's where the story gets strange. Because the man who saw all of this most clearly was not a banker or a senator. He was a temperance lobbyist from Ohio. Wayne Wheeler was born on a farm in 1869, worked his way through Oberlin College, and in 1894 was recruited by a new organization that had been founded in that same Ohio town the year before, the Anti-Saloon League. The League was unlike every temperance crusade before it, and the difference was corporate. It had a professional staff, a printing plant that eventually poured out tons of literature a day, a fundraising arm that ran on church pledges, and a legislative office that measured everything by one metric. It did not care about your church, your party, your drinking habits, or your opinions on any other question on earth. It asked one thing only: how do you vote on the saloon? Historians would later give its method a name, Wheelerism, and Wheeler became its master. The League endorsed Wett's opponents, financed challengers, flooded districts with printed attacks, and delivered disciplined blocks of church voters exactly where they would hurt. In 1905, Wheeler took down the sitting governor of Ohio, Myron Herrick, as a demonstration of what happened to politicians who crossed the League. Congressmen learned to fear a man who could not cast a single vote in their chamber. Wheeler kept card files on legislators, tracked every roll call, and could put thousands of telegrams on a senator's desk within a day. He wrote legislation in his own office and handed it to congressmen to introduce under their own names. Journalists of the era called him the most powerful unelected man in America, and the description was barely an exaggeration. He did not persuade Congress. He operated it. But Wheeler's genius was not just intimidation. It was sequencing. The League understood the Treasury wall as clearly as the brewers did, and it made a decision that looks obvious only in hindsight. Before America could be made dry, the government had to be weaned off liquor money. So the dry movement threw its considerable weight behind a cause that had nothing to do with alcohol, the income tax amendment, and found itself marching beside progressives and populists who wanted to tax Eastern fortunes for their own reasons. It was one of the strangest alliances in American politics. Prairie preachers who wanted the saloon dead marched beside progressives who wanted Wall Street taxed and Southern politicians who wanted the tariff cut. All of them pushed the same amendment for entirely different dreams, each planning to spend the same new dollars on a different future. In February 1913, they got it. The 16th Amendment was ratified, and Congress could now tax incomes without apportionment. That October, the Underwood Act introduced the new tax, a modest 1% on incomes above $3,000, rising to 7% on the largest fortunes. Most Americans paid nothing at all. It looks small. It was a revolution on a delayed fuse, because a tax that exists can always be raised, and a treasury with two paychecks no longer needs to defend the older one. What the Anti-Saloon League did next is the closest thing this story has to a confession. In November 1913, months after the income tax became law, the League gathered in Columbus for its 20th anniversary convention and publicly launched, for the first time, its campaign for a national prohibition amendment. Not a state campaign, national. The organization that had spent 20 years drying out counties and states now declared open war on the saloon at the federal level. In the same year, the federal government acquired its alternative paycheck. The League's own strategists made the connection explicitly. The Treasury objection was dying, and they knew it. The income tax still had to prove it could carry the load, and a world war did the proving. In 1916, the income tax supplied about 16% of federal revenue. In 1917, with America entering the war and rates rising steeply, the share doubled to roughly a third. By 1918, income taxes were supplying nearly two-thirds of federal revenue, and the War Revenue Act of 1917 alone yielded more than $2.3 billion in 1918. Set that against the entire liquor tax. In 2 years, the drinker had gone from carrying a third of the government to carrying loose change. The saloon's fiscal shield did not just crack, it evaporated. The war handed the dries everything else as well. Grain was suddenly a strategic resource, and distilling was halted in 1917 to conserve food. The great brewing families, Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, were of German descent, and the League's publicity machine tied beer to the enemy without blushing. In December 1917, the Prohibition Amendment swept through Congress, and then the state legislatures, gerrymandered toward exactly the rural districts where the League was strongest, ratified it at a speed that stunned observers. In January 1919, Nebraska became the 36th state, and the 18th Amendment was law. Congress even passed a separate Wartime Prohibition Act in November 1918, 10 days after the armistice, banning drink for a war that was already over, which tells you how completely the political ground had shifted. The Enforcement Act, named for Congressman Andrew Volstead but drafted in large part by Wheeler himself, passed over President Wilson's veto that October. It defined an intoxicating beverage as anything over 1/2 of 1% alcohol, a stricter line than millions of beer-drinking voters had expected when their legislatures ratified. At midnight on January 17th, 1920, the United States went dry, and the federal government wrote off its oldest surviving revenue stream as if it no longer needed the money. For 1 decade, that was even true. Step back and look at what had just happened. A revenue system that had made banning alcohol unthinkable for 50 years was replaced in under a decade, and the ban followed almost immediately. The preachers had been there all along, the hatchets had been there all along. What changed was the money. And at first the experiment appeared to work. Alcohol consumption fell sharply, and with it, for a time, some of the drunkenness, the disease, and the arrests the reformers had promised to end. The failure was not immediate, and that is precisely why the policy survived for 13 years. Now, let's talk about something the conventional narrative gets badly wrong, which is what Prohibition actually did to the economics of alcohol. If you have always assumed the 18th Amendment banned drinking, here is the correction the statute books insist on. It never prohibited drinking itself or the private possession of liquor bought before the ban. It prohibited manufacture, sale, and transport, which is to say it abolished the legal industry, not the demand. It did not eliminate the market. It privatized the tax. Legal alcohol had carried a federal excise on every barrel and bottle. Illegal alcohol carried none. The moment the 18th Amendment took effect, the margin that had flowed to the treasury for half a century flowed instead to whoever was willing to break the law, and it attracted exactly the talent you would expect. The government had not stopped the alcohol economy. It had resigned as its senior partner, and the new management kept the whole margin. Enforcement never matched the law's ambition, and the budget shows how large the gap was. The Prohibition Bureau was asked to police the drinking habits of a continent with a few thousand agents, paid so little that bribery became a standard business expense. In New York, police estimates put the number of speakeasies in the tens of thousands, more drinking places than the city had held when drinking was legal. The joke in Manhattan was that the hardest thing about finding a drink was choosing the block. The border leaked, the coastline leaked, and industrial alcohol, legal for solvents and fuel, leaked worst of all. There is one more mechanism worth naming, because it explains why the damage compounded. A legal industry pays for order, it pays taxes, obeys courts, settles disputes with lawyers, and sells a product whose strength and purity are regulated. An illegal industry buys disorder. Its contracts are enforced with violence. Its product drifts toward the strongest and cheapest form, which is why beer gave way to spirits during Prohibition, and its profits concentrate in the hands of whoever is most willing to kill. None of that was an accident of the era. It was the predictable physics of taking a tax market and handing it, margin and all, to the black market. And while the margins were being counted in Chicago, here is what the experiment was costing in kitchens and hospital wards. The government had one lever left against the bootleg supply chain, the industrial alcohol that bootleggers stole and redistilled, and it used that lever. From 1926, federal rules required industrial alcohol to be denatured with harsher formulas, including methanol, to render it undrinkable, and the policy stayed in place even as officials were warned that diverted supplies were reaching drinkers anyway. Bootleggers redistilled it imperfectly, and the redistilled product went into glasses in every city in America. Charles Norris, the chief medical examiner of New York City, watched the wards at Bellevue fill after every holiday, dozens dead or blinded in a single festive week, and he did something officials of his era rarely did. He counted the bodies, published the numbers with his own name attached, and publicly called the policy what he believed it was, a national experiment in extermination. His office became the country's conscience on the matter, and Washington did not thank him for it. The exact toll of the denaturing years remains disputed. A widely cited estimate runs to roughly 10,000 lives, and the medical examiner's records documented wave after wave of death, blindness, and paralysis. Wayne Wheeler, asked about those deaths, gave the answer that has stained his name since. The government, he argued, owed no protection to people breaking the law. They had, in his framing, poisoned themselves. The dead of the poisoning years have no memorial, and most of their names survive only in morgue ledgers. They were overwhelmingly working men, the kind who could not vouch for their bootlegger, buying by price because price was all they had. Then came the Jake leg. In 1930, Jamaica ginger extracts, a legal patent medicine that drinkers used for its alcohol, were adulterated with triorthocresyl phosphate, or TOCP, a neurotoxic industrial compound that attacked the nerves of the legs. Tens of thousands of Americans, most of them poor men in the South and Midwest, were left permanently crippled, walking with the high, slapping gait that blues musicians recorded songs about. Drinking itself was never the federal crime, and many of them had simply bought a patent medicine over the counter for its alcohol. They were the poorest victims of the whole experiment, men who could not afford the smuggled scotch that never stopped flowing at the country clubs. Prohibition's harms, like its taxes, were regressive. The comfortable drank on, the poor drank the poison. The scale of that untaxed economy is easiest to see in one man. In Chicago, the operation run by Al Capone was estimated by the government itself to be taking in tens of millions of dollars a year at its peak, by some estimates around $60 million, untaxed, uncounted, and enforced by gunmen instead of courts. Across the country, by one often quoted estimate, Prohibition cost the federal government about $11 billion in lost tax revenue over its lifetime, while Washington spent roughly $300 million trying to enforce it. And then the story delivers one of the cleanest ironies in American history. In October 1931, the federal government finally convicted Al Capone, and the following month a judge sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, for evading the income tax, the very tax whose arrival had made Prohibition possible. The instrument that opened the door to the dry decade was the only weapon that could reach the man who profited from it most. Wheeler himself never saw the end of what he built. In August 1927, his wife died in a fire at the family's lakeside cottage, and her father died of a heart attack trying to save her. Wheeler, already ill, died weeks later, at 57. The machine he had run through fear did not survive him. The League's income shrank, its discipline dissolved into factional quarrels, and when the money turned against his amendment a few years later, there was no one left with the skill to hold the wall. Institutions built around a single operator tend to die with him. 2 years after Wheeler's death, the deeper machinery went into reverse. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, and with it the paycheck that had made the whole experiment affordable. Income tax receipts collapsed with the economy. By 1932, they had fallen to nearly half their 1930 level. By 1933, they were below 40% of it, the weakest since the war. The federal government was suddenly desperately poor, cities were cutting teachers' pay, and a quarter of the workforce was idle. Everyone in Washington could do the arithmetic that followed. There was an entire industry employing brewers, farmers, truckers, and barmen sitting illegal and untaxed, while the treasury starved. The men who had been waiting for this moment were among the richest in the country. The Association Against the Prohibition Amendment had existed since 1918, but in the middle 1920s it was taken over by serious money. Pierre and Irénée DuPont of the chemical dynasty came in, alongside John Raskob of General Motors and the Democratic Party, the banker Grayson Murphy, and Senator James Wadsworth. It grew past 500,000 members, and, shrewdly, it refused donations from brewers and distillers so that no one could call it the liquor lobby. Its president, Jouett Schaus, put the argument in the only language the moment respected, predicting that repeal would bring the Treasury at least $1 billion a year. And its critics answered with an accusation that has followed the DuPonts ever since, that what the industrialists really wanted was for the return of alcohol taxes to take the pressure off the income taxes they themselves paid. Their sincerity, like Wheeler's, is arguable. The arithmetic is not. Repeal had become a revenue bill. By 1932, even the platforms had flipped. Franklin Roosevelt ran that year on a Democratic platform that called for repeal outright, and the sequence after his inauguration tells you what kind of measure this had become. It was not treated as a cultural question to be debated. It was treated as emergency finance. Amending the Volstead Act to legalize beer was pushed through in March 1933 in the same opening rush as the emergency banking legislation. The new president signing the beer bill is said to have remarked that it would be a good time for a beer. Legal beer returned on April the 7th, 1933, with a federal tax on every barrel, months before the constitutional amendment was even ratified. The 21st Amendment followed on December the 5th, 1933, and it carried a procedural signature of how urgent the money had become. It remains the only amendment in American history ratified by special state conventions rather than legislatures, a route chosen deliberately to go around the same rural state houses that had locked in the dry law. Those conventions were elected and assembled in under 10 months, the fastest deep constitutional reversal the country has ever executed. The Association Against the Prohibition Amendment dissolved itself the day ratification was complete. Job done. The Treasury's own books wrote the epitaph. Alcohol taxes supplied 2% of federal revenue in 1933, 9% in 1934, and 13% by 1936. The drinker was back on the payroll. Prohibition had arrived when the government could afford its conscience, and it left when the government could not. Now let me be precise about what historians actually argue, because the fiscal reading has its own critics, and they deserve the floor. For decades, the debate was really about motives, and each generation of historians indicted a different villain. The oldest school treated prohibition as pure moral pathology. Richard Hofstadter famously read it as the status anxiety of a fading rural Protestant America, and Andrew Sinclair's era of excess in 1962 fixed the image of the movement as repression and hypocrisy. Against that, later historians restored the movement's seriousness, and the fiscal reading entered the mainstream with Daniel Ockrent's Last Call in 2010, which laid out the income tax connection this video has been following. Lisa McGurr's The War on Alcohol in 2015 turned the lens again. She argued that the real legacy of Prohibition was the federal enforcement state it built, the prisons, the agencies, and the habits of policing that outlived repeal and flowed into the war on drugs. And economists like Donald Boudreaux have pressed the fiscal case in its strongest form, that the income tax opened the door and the Depression closed it. The strong fiscal reading has its critics, and they have a point. A century of genuine conviction, of women's organizing, and real damage done by real saloons cannot be reduced to a budget line, and the ratification map of 1919 cannot be explained by tax tables alone. The fairest summary is the one the evidence actually supports, and it is the same resolution this channel keeps arriving at in story after story. Motive and mechanism are different things. The movement supplied the pressure, honestly, and for generations. The money decided when the dam broke, in both directions. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because no single piece of this explains the strangest fact in the story, that a 100-year crusade won suddenly and lost just as suddenly within a single generation. Start with a government that for 50 years drew roughly a third of its income from drink, which made every prohibition bill a fiscal impossibility no matter how many marchers stood outside. Add a Supreme Court decision in 1895 that killed the obvious replacement and made reform a constitutional project. Add a single-issue political machine under Wayne Wheeler that understood the sequence, income tax first, prohibition second, and executed it with a discipline modern lobbyists still study. Add a world war that turned the income tax from an experiment into the engine of the state and turned German brewers into enemies. And then add a depression that destroyed the new paycheck and put the old one back on the table with a billion-dollar price tag attached by the repeal lobby. Any one of these alone is a footnote. In sequence, they are the whole arc, dry in 1920, wet in 1933, and at both turning points, the decisive vote was cast by the Treasury. The movement never changed its mind. The money changed its address twice. The pattern did not retire in 1933. American states in our own century have behaved the same way whenever their treasuries thinned. Casino gambling spread state by state through recessions, sold as budget relief. When the Supreme Court opened the door in 2018, sports betting went from felony to phone app in a few years, driven by revenue projections. Cannabis followed the same road in state after state, argued not in the language of liberty, but in the language of tax receipts. The moral map of America still gets redrawn the way it was redrawn in 1913 and 1933. None of this requires anyone to be insincere. The reformers of every era mean what they say. But between the sermon and the statute stands a treasury, and the treasury votes on its own schedule. When the money is sufficient, sin becomes a budget line, and when the budget starves, the ledger votes first. The next time someone tells you prohibition was simply a moral crusade that rose and failed, you will know the quieter version underneath. The crusade was real, and for 100 years it lost, because the government drank a third of its income at the bar. It won in the one decade when a new tax made virtue affordable, and it was repealed in the one decade when a collapsing economy made virtue too expensive. The sermons filled the streets. The ledger picked the dates. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, because this channel follows the money underneath the wars, the crusades, and the crashes, one ledger at a time. And tell me in the comments which lever you think really decided it. The income tax of 1913 that removed the obstacle, Wheeler's machine that forced the vote, or the Depression that bought repeal. I read every single one. And if this held your attention this far, a like genuinely helps these stories reach people who were taught the tidy version.